morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry to kill the music there. Good morning. You're nice and awake. My name's Christopher Ludwig. I'm the content director for Automotive Logistics and Finished Vehicle Logistics, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for what is actually the 5th Finished Vehicle Logistics Import-Export North America Conference here in Baltimore. Over the course of the last 4 years, it's a conference and a topic which has just become more interesting, to use something of a euphemism, more complicated, more dynamic as well, and over, whether we're talking about regulations, we're talking about political side, weather, capacity, driver issues, you name it, all the things we'll spend some time going into depth over the next couple of hours. But before we go into the program, I'd like to invite Rick Powers from the Maryland Port Administration and the Port of Baltimore, our premier sponsor here at this event since we started, to officially open the event. Rick.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 5th conference, first finished vehicle conference to be held in the Port of Baltimore, Maryland here. The first year we had our conference over at the cruise terminal. It was fine. In the last 3 years, up the street. But I think this venue is absolutely the best. I really do. It's really worked out well. And I think, Chris, you've done a great job putting this together. On behalf of Governor Larry Hogan and Executive Director of the Port, Jim White, we welcome you to the conference, welcome you to Baltimore. And you'll see this venue is a lot easier to get around town. You've got good access to the inner harbor, so I think you'll enjoy yourselves. It's a short program today. It's one day, so we got to get on with the program. Not too much talk from me, but I just want to mention a few things about the Port of Baltimore. Not an infomercial, Chris. Don't worry about it. Last year in 2017, we had our best year ever for finished vehicles. Over 807,000 units crossed our docks. This year, we're on pace to break that. So we've had a very, very good year, and we're proud of that. And I think we're the premier port in the country for automotive quality handling. We really pride ourselves. We have a group called the QChat, which stands for the Quality Cargo Handling Action Team. And it's a group that brings all stakeholders together, be it labor, be it processors, drivers, vessel owners, the whole group together. And they have 38 metrics, and they grade themselves every time a ship's in and out. And when they come back once a month and look at their grades, look for possible improvement. And so that's driven our quality to, I think, world-class level as far as cargo handling here. The other thing I'd like to mention is it's expensive to operate a port. I know everybody's got big expenses in their business, but just to give you an idea, our 6-year capital plan here, over $800 million. You may not always see the investment. Some of it's underwater. But it's expensive to keep a port operating and functioning at a high level. But we, at the Port of Baltimore, Maryland Port Administration, are committed to that. So we've committed to a 6-year capital plan of over $800 million to keep the port running at top speed and great condition now into the future. So just thought I'd mention those few comments. And enjoy the program. If you have any questions for me, I'll be walking around, and I'm glad to answer them. Over to Chris. Thank you.
Okay, Rick, thank you very much, and thanks again to the Port of Baltimore for its continued support. We'll talk more about it, of course, later, but this evening, right after the program, we have a barbecue and dinner and drinks across the road at Tiranogue, right in the Inner Harbor, hosted again by the Port of Baltimore, so we'll be continuing our program well into the evening there. I want to also just take a moment to thank the other sponsors and supporter of this event. As mentioned, of course, Port of Baltimore is our premier sponsor. We also want to thank our gold sponsors, Inform, Montway, and Valenius Wilhelmsen Solutions, who, of course, yesterday hosted the cocktail reception, which we held for the first time at this event. So thank you to them. We also have our global sponsor, Confezione Andrea Group. Please take some time downstairs. There's a Corvette outside with wearing some of the cover cars, some of the material from our sponsor here. So please take some time during a coffee break or at some point today and go down there. And thanks also to our silver sponsors, CP, Ports America, and VPS. Most of our sponsors have a booth outside, or some of them have a booth, so take some time to visit. They have specialist services and products and solutions, obviously very specific to this industry. So again, thank you to them. A couple of points before we kind of dig into the program here. This event is being streamed live, as we do for most of our events, so we have a global audience outside of the room here as well. There's instructions there, although no one here should necessarily need to use that. But if you do want to watch live during a session which you can't be in the room for, you can also do that as well. So thanks to our global audience. We also, important certainly for everyone in the room here, we have a conference app. So if you haven't already, please do take a moment to download the conference app. It doesn't only have information on the program and things like that. You can contact, or you can see our delegates. You can send email messages and messages to other delegates to communicate and network that way. We're also going to be doing some polling, which for those of you who have been at other events, we do this sort of live anonymous polling, which we'll look to do. In fact, we will shortly open up with a question to get you sort of going on that. So we'll take a vote shortly on the first of those questions, and then we'll leave that open throughout this session to give you a chance to vote and sign in, and then we'll do some other questions as well. It's a good way to take the pulse of the room, get a sense of what you're thinking without necessarily having to do that publicly. There's also red and green cards. I'm right about that, right? There's red and green cards on the table. These are for quick straw polls, so our speakers can sort of ask you quickly throughout the day, yes or no, red or green on a particular question, because the kind of objective of this event is to be as interactive as possible. So that's both in the room here with voting, with comments and questions, which you can also do via the app as well if you're too shy to put up your hand, and also after lunch. For the first time, we're going to hold our ideas labs. These are structured workshops on 4 different subject areas, which are led by a moderator. We'll have clipboards, we'll have notes going around, so it'll be a chance to workshop specific ideas more directly in the areas of your specialization, and then we'll capture that output and share it with the group more widely after the conference as well. But obviously it's a great chance to interact with your fellow delegates in more specifically. So hopefully some of you have been downloading the app. If you have, like I said, we'd like to do is call up a poll question to kind of kick off our conference here. So if you've downloaded the app, you just have to go onto the home screen. There's a tab called polling. So you just click onto the polling, and then the question, which has already come up here, should shortly appear on that screen. As it gets loaded up, obviously I'll just tell you what the question is as soon as you'll see it. So the question is, what is currently the biggest challenge for North American vehicle imports and exports in your opinion? Is it international trade uncertainty, the NAFTA negotiations, tariffs, trade war threats, etc.? Is it lack of space and investment for vehicle processing and storage, particularly at ports? Is it inland transport capacity and service in and out of ports, so rail and truck connections, for example? Is it ocean capacity and service in and out of ports? Or is it poor visibility and planning of vehicle flows in and out of ports? So we're going to leave that question open right now. We'll come back to it after our presenters and after our Q&A to kind of reveal the answer, and again we'll hold more polling. So again, either now or at some point throughout the session, please make sure you download the app and answer our polling question. Okay, so again, as Rick alluded to, it's with 5 years into this conference now, and this industry and sector continues to develop. Port of Baltimore obviously had record numbers and is headed towards that again. I think that's not necessarily an unfamiliar position for ports across the country. At the same time, we have obviously a lot of change, or a lot of potential change around technology. You just have to pick up a newspaper to read about investments in autonomous driving, in truck platooning, in artificial intelligence, and in all kinds of connectivity. And there's obviously a lot of potential to bring more of this into ports. Some of this is happening already, even if on trials and small scale, and a lot of things along the way. So I think a lot of dynamic change can and should come to the port, import-export sector in the coming years. And that sort of alludes to our headline for the conference, Gateways to the Future, Upgrading Import-Export Models for Finished Vehicle Logistics. And as that kind of headline alludes to as well, it's not just about the physical port and the port facility. Obviously, this is a system, and it falls down without the inland connections, without the communication throughout the chain, without all of the services and expertise that people in this room bring to the industry every day. And we've certainly seen some issues in North America, perhaps particularly in the earlier part of the year, whether to do with weather around winter, but some other capacity and service problems that sort of continue to show that although we can talk about artificial intelligence and automation, there are still some, I don't know if we can say basic or some essential processes that there's still a lot of room for improvement. And of course, in the background or in the foreground for some places, there's also obviously risks around trade, whether it's the tariffs already with China, the threats of import tariffs, the NAFTA negotiations. I'm not sure if our panelists are going to be able to give you all the answers on those today, but nonetheless, they are questions that we all need to consider and watch carefully, even as we go about our day-to-day business and the essential, fulfilling the essential services we need to keep this sector moving. And this is an industry, after all, which is certainly used to dealing with things that are somewhat beyond its control, whether, again, that's weather or that's change in product mix, which impacts capacity. Import-export services need to adjust and adapt and be flexible around that. And again, we don't do that in isolation. We don't do that in one facility. It has to be across the system, and it has to be involving all the kinds of people and services and companies in this room. So that's really the spirit of this conference. It is about collaboration. It is about connecting with your partners in car makers, your partners on the logistics service side, your partners in ports, your partners in government and on regulatory side. Everyone needs to be communicating and working together around that. And so our first session, we're very fortunate to have some speakers to get us going and talking around some of those issues. Very pleased that we could have Kirk Clausen, for example, Port Finance Agent from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration, who can give us a view from this agency responsible for many areas to do with ports, port infrastructure, investment and service. And then we'll also hear from Brandon Mason, who's the Automotive Director and Mobility Leader for PwC. Brandon will answer all of your difficult questions about the direction of the market, regulation. No, but Brandon, of course, give us some forecasts, give us some views on some of the questions of the day and what direction we may or may not be headed. And there'll be a lot of time for Q&A after that. So looking forward to all that. So I'm pleased shortly to hand over to our first speaker, as I mentioned, from the Maritime Administration, or MARAD, which is the agency of the Department for Transportation responsible for waterborne transport, its integration with other modes, as well as the U.S. merchant marine fleet and service. It works in many areas to support shipping, ports, shipbuilding, port operations, safety, and national security. And so with that, I'm very pleased to give over the podium to Kirk Clausen.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here among you at your conference, and thank you for inviting the Maritime Administration to speak with you. Again, Kirk Clausen, I'm with the Office of Ports and Waterways at the U.S. Maritime Administration. I have some slides that I put together. They're not all inclusive by any means. I thought they might be interesting and hopefully a little bit helpful, but we'll see. Strong Ports. Strong Ports is a brand name. Strong Ports program is legislated in Title 46 USC 50302. That's a federal statute. Our mission is to lead the development and expansion and modernization of port infrastructure, including water, road, and rail for the benefit of every American. Our vision is a modern, efficient system of diverse, modern inland and coastal ports that are integrated into the surface transportation system. So obviously, hopefully that feeds well into some of the questions that I saw on the screen anyway before walking up here, and hopefully some of your concerns and daily hurdles that you probably deal with on your jobs. Growing congestion and the marine highway solution. One of the things our office focuses on is how to increase that capacity. We all know international trade growth is increasing, and the infrastructure that supports all that trade has limited capacity. So we're trying to find ways and work with obviously all stakeholders to try to increase capacity. One of the key charges of our office is to increase waterborne commerce. The U.S. moves about 6% of freight, is the stat I have here on the slide. The stat here is Europe, 40%. Don't quote me on the dates of those, but it's probably relatively accurate anyway. So obviously our charge here in the U.S. is to increase the capacity and the use of our great waterways. I put this slide in here. This may be, it is quite an oversimplification for sure, but just wanted to give you a feel for what the Maritime Administration, at least my office, the Office of Ports and Waterways, how we work with other, shown on the slide, are other federal agencies, more or less. You see the U.S. Coast Guard, you see the United States Army Corps of Engineers listed, Homeland Security, Federal Railroad Administration, Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, EPA, as well as FHWA, and of course at the state and local levels, the DOTs and the MPOs. Again, oversimplification. There's obviously not just the governmental stakeholders that we coordinate with. There's the public and private companies as well. So just wanted to give you a feel. And the Maritime Administration, my Office of Ports and Waterways obviously has interest in overseeing, bringing advantages to the ports and making sure that they have a voice. Ports, 21st century definition. The purpose of a port is for the direct intermodal exchange of people or freight. Ports have the infrastructure that allows vehicles and trains to come alongside ships. Seems pretty straightforward. You'd be surprised how many times people try to talk about ports and they have trouble coming up with a straightforward, easily understandable definition. So this is just something we like to share with folks to make sure everyone's on the same page, and I trust that most of you folks are quite aware of this. Different kinds of ports. Different cargoes and passengers require different port infrastructure. Ports are all unique. The list I'm about to show you is by no means supposed to be isolated. There's all different sorts of ports. Our nation needs all different kinds of facilities of different sizes in different regions to help support our nation's economy. I won't read all this off to you, it's a bit verbose, but certainly there's container terminals, container ports, cruise ports, energy, break bulk, commercial fishing, and certainly the one that probably is often used and discussed in among this audience is RoRo, roll on, roll off. Handles vehicle and heavy equipment exports and imports, needs ramps, docks with width, may offer value-added services for vehicle prep. I'm sure that sounds very familiar to this audience. And this is a great picture. I like this picture. Spaceports, something we don't really think about too often. You think about private companies and governmental activities, launching, for example, satellites into space. Or we try to reuse our equipment these days. So here you see the picture of the barge moving, looks like the fuselage of a rocket back to port. Port Typology GIS project. This is an ongoing project. I thought I'd put this in here. It just gives you a sense of what my office is interested in. We're putting together this project in particular, and it's an ongoing project, just to identify the ports in the United States, the different types of cargoes that move through those ports. And a lot of it's about education. You talk to people on the Hill in DC and throughout the country, for that matter, and they don't really understand the economic importance of ports and the reason you need all these different kinds of ports. So this is just a tool that we put together to, in a real-time fashion, make it easy to understand where the ports are and the types of cargoes that the ports support. The Port Planning and Investment Toolkit. This is a joint venture between the American Association of Port Authorities and MARAD. I don't have a website link on the slide, but if you Google or if you do an internet search for Port Planning and Investment Toolkit and MARAD, it's a good document for planning purposes. The document has 3 modules, a planning module, a feasibility module, as well as a funding / financing module. And it's a good overview for those both in the industry and those outside of the industry to understand what it takes to put an infrastructure project together and to help get funding for it, which is critically important. US DOT assistance programs. Here's a bit of a laundry list, a few bullets anyway. I won't spend too much time here. The BUILD program. The BUILD program is a discretionary grant program. It's competitive. This is the formerly named TIGER grant program, if you've heard of the TIGER grant program. It's not called BUILD. This is ongoing as we speak. The applications were due a few months back, and reviews are ongoing. So that'll be an exciting outcome to see where the $1.5 billion with a B of monies go. Not just to ports, obviously, but to infrastructure, transportation infrastructure throughout the country across all modes. Likewise, the Infra Grant program, applications were accepted by November of last year. The grants, the proposed grants have been announced. I have to check the news. I'm not sure if Congress has had their 60 days yet, but it's coming up close if they haven't already. I encourage you to go out and do a search of all the projects that have been proposed for grants. There are a couple of port-related projects on that list. The TIFIA program. TIFIA is a loan program, Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. This is a loan program to finance service transportation. It offers low rates. It's a low-rate loan program. You can borrow for the long term, 35 years past substantial construction completion. It'll fund 33% of eligible project costs. And projects that are inside the gate of ports are eligible for this program. Traditionally, this has been a program that supported highway development as well as transit development, but it's branched out into other modes, including the maritime space. Likewise, the RIF program, Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing program. It's a loan program. It's been around for a while. It's had some, hasn't got a lot of traction at certain points in time. I believe this is an up-and-coming program, even though it's been around since for well over a decade now. Ports have a lot of rail. We're currently working with a handful of ports to try to help them access this program. I have high hopes that this program, and I'll talk about the Build America Bureau, which administers this program a little bit later in my slide deck. that this program will eventually be more of a player in the financing market than it has been. Private activity bonds. This is a financing tool for privately funded infrastructure to take advantage of tax-exempt bond rates, using a public conduit to issue their debt. Lots of ports have and continue to use this vehicle. Port conveyance program. This is a program, I have a few slides on this as well, so I won't spend too much time here, to transfer federal properties for use as a port. And America's Marine Highway program. This is a grant program. There are 3 stages of this program. One is a Marine Highway route designation. Secondly is a Marine Highway project designation. And last but not least is the actual grant program. And the point of this program is to help facilitate and support operations, marine highway operations, expanding and funding and startups of those operations. So I'd encourage you to, if those are relevant or of interest, certainly to look those up. There's plenty of detail on the internet. This is a good overview slide, just kind of a summary slide of where some of our funding has gone. And it's probably tough to see from your seat, but you can see the dots across the country, scattered across the country for Tiger and eventually, hopefully, Build, the grant programs. Fast Lane, which is now called Infra. Deepwater ports in the Gulf. We have a program, I don't have a slide for it, in our office that deals with a regulation of startup of deepwater ports. That's obviously a big infrastructure push these days as the U.S. exports more and more oil and gas, liquefied natural gas. And the marine highway projects are shown on there as well as the port conveyance projects. The Build America Bureau, I had mentioned this. This is, I like to think of this as the bank, the quote-unquote bank at USDOT. This program oversees the TIFIA and RIFA loan programs. So whereas Merit has a broad umbrella of interest across the maritime space, for a project, Merit has interest in outreach and project development. And we work closely with the Build America Bureau as project sponsors get closer to needing the actual financing for their projects. Build America, as you can see, streamlines access, encourages innovative best practices, and provides technical assistance. Port conveyance program. I had mentioned this in my other slide. This program transfers surplus federal land to states and local governments at no cost for use as a port facility in perpetuity. That's a pretty good deal, right? Merit approves applications and submits recommendations to the landowning federal agency and then oversees properties after the conveyance. Since this program has been enacted, we transferred 13 properties and certainly have interest in other properties that are ongoing. This is an example of the port conveyance program that I thought might be relevant to this audience. In 1998, the Rhode Island Commerce Corporation received title to a 96-acre property in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, formerly known as the Naval Construction Battalion Center, or NCBC, which is operated as the Port of Davisville. The Port of Davisville uses the NCBC property for auto processing, an intermodal yard, as well as public and private warehousing offering long-term storage of autos and auto components loaded and unloaded through the port. So it's a good example. There's a snapshot of some cars being rolled off. And overall, this you can see, again, I know you probably can't, this might be tough to see from where you're sitting, but just the dots represent some of the different port conveyances that have occurred across the country. And you see the Port of Memphis on there is a summer 2018 transfer, so I believe that'll be number 14. Other federal aid opportunities. The FAST Act which was passed in late 2015, provides eligible funding over 5 years. The Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. This is formula funding for states and MPOs for priority projects. Transportation projects that facilitate the direct intermodal transfer, interchange, and access of freight into and out of a port terminal are eligible for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. CMAQ, Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program. Again, I don't know if you can see back there, those are pretty big numbers. $58 billion for the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Those get allocated from the federal level out to the states, and the states then have different ways of managing these monies, whether they allocate it out directly to projects or sub-allocate it out to regional and local governments for further distribution. $12 billion for the CMAQ program. Formula funding for states and MPOs to meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act. Non-road vehicles and non-road engines used in port-related freight operations in non-attainment or maintenance areas are eligible. Again, apology, MPOs is a Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm guessing most of you know of that term, but if not, that's what MPO is, regional governance. National Highway Freight Program, formula funding for states to improve movement of freight on the National Highway Freight Network. Up to 10% of the National Highway Freight Program funds are eligible for inside-the-gate port projects. And that program, the National Highway Freight Program, that was new with the FAST Act. And to be eligible for that funding, states had to submit a state freight plan to be eligible to receive that funding. Infra program, I won't talk more about that. We already touched on that. The last one there is the Advanced Transportation and Congestion Management Technologies Deployment Grants. This is grant funding to develop and deploy advanced transportation technologies to improve safety, efficiency, and system performance and infrastructure ROI, return on investment. Application reviews are ongoing as of August 2018, as of now. I would expect announcements for the most recent round to be over the next couple months, but don't quote me on that timeline. And the first 2 rounds of that program, affectionately known as ATC-MTD, there were some port-related projects, so certainly that program has applicability to your stakeholders. Intelligent Transportation Systems. MARAD, in conjunction with Intelligent Transportation Systems research programs, seeks to increase cargo capacity and reliability of freight moving through ports. MARAD is engaged in a multi-year research program that seeks to achieve 2 primary goals: to identify opportunities to conduct research that addresses critical freight movement and ITS infrastructure gaps, and 2, to identify opportunities for pilot projects and programs to be deployed, including technology transfer. And just some of the current ITS initiatives related to ports that MARAD partakes in at USDOT. One is a truck staging study. This study is done in cooperation with the ITS Joint Program Office, ITS JPO at USDOT, as well as Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. The state of practice of business case assessment has been completed. That was kind of a first step, and now ongoing, we're putting together a best practice report. So as we speak today, interviews are ongoing, questionnaires have been gone out to public and stakeholders, and a feasibility report is being put together, and the feasibility report is for potential solutions for some of the issues that ITS might play a factor in. Although it's not all about ITS, if there are non-technological solutions, that'd certainly be a part of our solution report as well. The Port Plan Investment Toolkit, I mentioned this before. There's a 4th module coming out. That's the ITS module. I look for that in early 2019. That will discuss planning, feasibility, funding and deployment of ITS systems in the port environment. And we're also working on a formal request for comments information. That's in the works at USDOT, and that is just a tool to get public comment, official comment, in addition to all the informal comment that we receive from stakeholders on an ongoing basis. So look for that in hopefully the months to come. My last slide here, I just wanted to point out, MARAD has 10 what we call gateway directors throughout the country. These are folks who have deep experience in the maritime sector. What I've shown you today is a bit of a snapshot of some of the programs that my office deals in. Throughout MARAD, there are other programs for sure that I did not talk about today. I encourage you to look on our website for your interest. And again, the gateway directors are great resources. I would encourage you to reach out to them. And they also conduct Port Talk, we call them Port Talk workshops throughout the country, which is just a gathering of stakeholders in a region to talk about issues and develop solutions of those issues. With that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you once again for having the Maritime Administration and me here today at your conference, and look forward to hearing any questions from the group.
Thank you, Kirk. First of all, quick note, we'll send you a link to the presentations early as possible after the event. So if you were struggling to see or struggling to write down, we'll clear anything with Kirk just to make sure, but you will get access to those presentations so you can get all that detail. Because I think there's a lot of great detail in there. It shows a wide variety of programs, obviously, at the federal and state level to help support the sort of services and infrastructure and investment that the industry needs to sustain itself, and also, importantly, I think, prepare for the future, particularly around some of the intelligence transport systems. And maybe also the future rocket launches that this industry will also be a part of. So thank you again to Kirk, and as mentioned, we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Before our next speaker, I just want to remind you all again about the polling that we're doing, and in case you haven't had a chance to vote yet, or have been onto our app, please do so. Please, again, download that app and register there. It's all very straightforward. As you download it, you'll just have to put in your email, and the rest will take care of it. And again, this is the question that we've asked the audience to vote on to let us know what you're thinking, which we'll come to at the end. So good number of you have already voted, but just take a minute during the rest of the session now or afterwards to do that. So with that, I'd like to invite our next speaker up. Many of you will have heard Brandon at our events before. Brandon Mason from PwC, always there with some great insight into what's happening in the market right now, but very importantly, what we might see coming up ahead. So, Brandon, the stage is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First off, thanks to Chris for sort of bailing me out, saying I don't have to have all the answers as it relates to trade and other regulatory matters for our industry. But there certainly is a lot to talk about. I don't know about you all, but I wake up every morning and scan the headlines and hope that nothing dramatic has changed over the night, particularly maybe between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. on Twitter. But usually I talk about a lot of the trends that are impacting our industry, auto finance, inventory, incentives, and the like. What I thought I would do is spend most of my time today talking about two key issues, and particularly given where we're at today, to talk about recent developments to the proposed fuel economy standards, and then obviously the potential impact and current state of where we're at with the escalating trade war and tariffs. Still give you some insight around our sales and assembly outlook for the region, and then we'll save the rest for the Q&A session. So let's go ahead and start off here and talk about our global alternative propulsion outlook. And I think some of you have seen this slide before, just to kind of set the stage here. This breaks down the alternative propulsion types by type. So you've got hybrid, both mild and full. You've got plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, pure electric vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And this is globally, and we have it stacked up. So for those of you that can't see all the numbers, today we're standing at about 4.9% of global market share, just over 4 million units. We're forecasting that to reach about 22 million units by 2024 and about 19 or 20% of global share. What I'd like to do is break that down a little bit for you. If you look at where that volume is going to go in the future, of that 22 million, about 30% of that volume, or about 6.5 million units, will be in China. And if we think about in a future state where we've got more build where you sell things happening rather than, you know, a huge mix of imports and exports, current environment notwithstanding, China will very much lead the way, which sort of makes sense, right? The largest automotive market in the world, but they have a new energy vehicle policy that's in full effect right now, so we do expect a pretty significant ramp up in China. Next on that list is the European Union, also at around 30%, or about 6.5 million. And if you look at the current legislative environment there, with the Euro 6 standards and beyond, that makes a lot of sense too, that you're going to have a significant amount of alternative propulsion vehicles. You're also seeing more and more talk in Europe about an outright ban on combustion vehicles, both gasoline and diesel. So that's where you're seeing a significant ramp up as well. Next is Japan. Japan has about 20% of that volume, or about 4.5 million units. Many of the Japanese OEMs are already leaders in hybrid vehicle technology, so again, not a big surprise there. If you're wondering where the US is at in 2024, we're at about 11% share, or about 2.5 million units. So again, it's not apples to apples because you're talking about production versus sales, and we are a big net importer here in the US. But if you look at the current environment today, where electric vehicles in the US make about 1% of sales, and if you include all hybrid and alternative propulsion vehicles, we're somewhere around 4% market share. We're already lagging behind the rest of the world, which again, we're forecasting to be at about 6.8% share by the end of this year. And that gap is going to continue to widen and widen and widen. And I'm setting the stage here in case you haven't figured it out yet, around the current CAFE and fuel economy and emission standards in the US. This is certainly setting the stage for that. To be fair, this is from the AutoFacts team Q3 release. We'd already assumed that there was going to be a deep divide based on the regulatory and demand environment here in the US. But I think, you know, given the current proposal for fuel economy and emission standards in the US, this is going to continue to widen that gap. All right? So let's talk about what is being proposed. You may have seen that NHTSA and EPA, this has been long rumored and discussed, but they finally came out with their new proposal, and they titled it SAFE, which stands for Safer, Affordable, Fuel-Efficient Vehicles. I love those acronyms. I love those government acronyms. They're great. All right, so the chart on the left shows there's a couple things going on here. Let me try and set it up for you. So the pink line that you see is the current fleet performance, or the historic fleet performance. The black line below that has been up until now, and we're through the 2016 model year, the total fleet standard. So that combines both light trucks and passenger cars. And you can see until, you know, up until the 2016 model year, we haven't gotten the full 2017 model year information yet. 2016 is the latest that NHTSA has. The industry didn't really have a difficult time reaching the fleet standards. But you'll see in 2016, they actually dipped below the standards. Shouldn't be a big shock, right, given where we're at with the light truck versus passenger car mix. I actually think overall fuel economy dipped slightly last year as well, again, given the fleet mix going on. The gray dotted line that you see above, that was the original target back in 2012 when the Obama administration passed the 2025 CAFE standard. Now that's always going to be a bit of a moving target, right? Many of you have probably heard me say before that at the time, the assumption was that it was going to be 54.5 miles per gallon requirement by 2025, the on-road standard being somewhere around 48 to 49 miles per gallon. Given the fleet mix assumptions, that's actually come down considerably, because at the time, the administration thought that by 2025, 2/3 of our market would be passenger cars, 1/3 would be light trucks. It's actually just the opposite. So that number was going to come down anyways. The dotted yellow line below that shows what the new proposed standard would be, which essentially says we're going to freeze our emission and fuel economy assumptions from the 2020 model year on. And so, there's a little bit of a gap still to make up between what you see there for the 2016 model year until we get to 2020, but then it's frozen. And the Trump administration estimates that that number will work out to around 37 miles per gallon. So, give or take 10 miles per gallon variance by the time you hit 2025. The other big takeaway here is that the administration is proposing revoking California's waiver to enforce their own more stringent standards under the Clean Air Act. That's a big one, right? Governor Brown came out and said, I'm not going to repeat his words exactly, but he was rather critical of that announcement. But this is something that we've been expecting for some time now. So I think one of the big risks here for OEMs and why they've come out and said, look, we need one national standard, because otherwise you're playing two different games here. If you include California in the 13 or so states that follow California's rules, that makes up about 30% of our market in the US. So that's a huge chunk, which would have presumably much more stringent standards. So the government is trying to revoke that waiver and enforce one national standard. But of course, California has already said they will fight that tooth and nail in court. So it appears that we've got some considerable fighting ahead in the courts to figure out where this is going to shake out. But I thought it was interesting. And I think the initial report right now is like 600 pages, so I haven't had time to read through it all. I've skimmed through some of the parts, and there's some head scratchers in there. There's a public comment period that's upcoming, which they're going to have several sessions. I think one's in D.C., one's in Detroit, one's in L.A., but the final ruling should be issued presumably sometime in the fall in terms of final recommendations. But some highlights from the new SAFE proposal, and again, this would replace the CAFE standard that we've had since 2012. So I already mentioned, freezing emission and fuel economy standards from model year 2020. There's some assumptions in there around, and there's some cost assumptions as well, but they assume that there's going to be a reduction in overall vehicle ownership cost. I guess that's related to, that you would need less technology to meet those more stringent fuel economy standards, and so the overall cost of a vehicle would be less. There's another assumption that there would be fewer crashes and fatalities because with those lower vehicle costs, you would have higher turnover of vehicles, and so thus buying newer cars means safer cars. Reduction in regulatory costs for OEMs and suppliers, again, just because you don't have to meet those more stringent standards. And then there's a reduction in societal costs, and so they kind of lump all that in and say, well, with lower costs to meet those standards, with fewer injuries and fatalities, there's lower insurance costs, and lower congestion. Those are going to save society dollars. And then they do forecast a slight increase in the daily fuel consumption and CO2 emissions as a result. So, everybody's got their own take on it. These are their bullet points. I think from a compliance standpoint, what's interesting here is, and we'll talk about this when we get to the tariff discussion as well, it's hard to plan long term with something that's potentially a short-term phenomenon, right? So whether it's negotiation tactics or if there's a new presidential administration in just over 2 years, these could change dramatically at the drop of a hat. So this one is a bit more difficult because of the infighting between California and the states that follow their procedure, and then the rest of the country. That will be interesting. But in the meantime, automakers are going to be caught in the middle. I think what we've heard most OEMs say is that they still want to forge ahead with their alternative propulsion strategies and then see where the rest of this plays out, and they can adjust their fleet accordingly. Interesting to note, so there are different projections about what percentage of electric or zero-emission vehicles would be needed to meet the California standard. They have it's called a zero emissions vehicle mandate. The assumption is that by 2025, the average fleet in California would need to have somewhere between 10 and 15% of new vehicle sales be zero emission or electric vehicles. And I think the number today in California is like somewhere between 3 and 4% versus the national average of about 1%. So just to give you some context of where that gap is and what would need to be met. So, obviously keeping a close eye on this one, but prepare for some pretty salacious headlines here in the coming months as this finds its way into the courts. And a lot of you have seen this slide before too, just to show you how we got here, right? So this shows the gap between light truck and passenger car. Again, back in 2012, when the original CAFE standards were put out, we had a roughly 50-50 share versus, car versus light truck, and now we're vastly different. We're heading towards 70+% share for light trucks. Okay, what I'd like to do with this slide is do a little bit of an academic exercise. Some of you have seen this data before. This is import tariff data. We all know that the U.S. is a net importer of vehicles. We import about 8 million vehicles a year, and that includes Canada and Mexico. And then we export about 4 million vehicles a year. So what I thought would be interesting is what would it look like, because we've seen a lot of numbers thrown around lately, right, with tariffs, 15, 25, 40%, whatever. So what would it look like if the U.S. imposed a 25% import tariff on all the products that it imported, all the finished vehicles that it imported? Let's start off, and this includes Canada and Mexico. So we all know right now Canada, Mexico, South Korea, through the Chorus Agreement, which I think has or is being renegotiated, all have 0% import. Germany and Japan right now have a 2.5% import tariff. China is off this list, just in case you're wondering context-wise. They don't crack the top 5. China sent about 60,000 vehicles to the U.S. last year. We sent about 270,000 vehicles to China last year. So we'll get to China in a minute. But let's start off with Canada. So last year, Canada imported 1.8 million units into the U.S. The average vehicle value was around $23,000. And so if you were to add a 25% tariff to that, what would that look like? The average vehicle price from imports from Canada would increase by about $6,000. Germany imported about 500,000 units last year at around $41,000 per vehicle. And again, not a big surprise, just because those are primarily luxury vehicles or exclusively luxury vehicles that are coming into it. That would increase vehicle prices by $9,000 per vehicle for imports from Germany. Let's see, Mexico, 2.4 million units were imported last year, $19,000 a vehicle. That would increase vehicle prices by about $5,000. Japan, 1.7 million units. That would increase by $5,000. And then South Korea, just under 1 million units last year. That would increase vehicle prices by about $4,000. And so at this point, it's up to the OEM, right? Do we pass that cost along to consumers, or do we eat that cost ourselves? But, we're already kind of running slim on margins here, folks. I mean, adding 25% or having to eat 25%, that's a pretty big pill to swallow. And again, this is slightly an academic exercise. There's still the chicken tax in place. I think with the Chorus Agreement, the idea was that would phase out over the next several years. But there's some big dollars at stake here, right? So again, just sort of an academic exercise to show what that might look like and what consumers and OEMs might be dealing with if these import tariffs are in fact imposed. But it really comes down to, so if we forget about NAFTA for a second, and it's kind of hard to forget about, I'll come back to NAFTA in a minute, but NAFTA aside, it's really about the next 3 largest economies in the world, and that's China, Germany, and Japan. And so what we have here is a breakout of what their current import tariff strategy is. So China, if you've been paying attention to China, there's been a lot of change lately. So historically, China had a 25% import tariff for vehicles brought into the country with the goal of localizing production. In a sort of an olive branch moment to the U.S., they said, we're going to lower import tax down to 15%, and then we're going to remove the 50-50 JV requirement for automakers. Well, that was short-lived. I think that lasted about 2 weeks. And if you've seen the headlines over the last week or two, China has now said that the import tariff for vehicles produced in the U.S. is a whopping 40%. 40%. Think about that. That's crazy. Now, what we also have here is the sort of the trade imbalance, right? So this is one thing that's often touted. So we have the total value of exports from the U.S. to these countries and then imports in, and this is light vehicles and auto parts. So if you look at China, for example, and again, we don't import a lot of vehicles from China. So there's not a lot of, if you think about who's got the upper hand here, at least as it relates to automotive, it would appear to be China, because we send far more vehicles to China than they send to us. Also, that's the largest automotive market in the world. Now, you have to look on a vehicle-by-vehicle basis, But I mean, some of those vehicles, if you start to hit critical mass in China, there starts to be a lot more incentive to just localize production and forego that 40% import tariff that could be in place. But the trade imbalance strictly on light vehicles and auto parts is $4.3 billion for China. Then if you go to Germany, where the U.S. exports, basically the only products that they export are the German brands that are produced in North America and then sent back to the European Union. There's a trade imbalance there of $22 billion. And finally, Japan, a trade imbalance of $52 billion. Now, the U.S. sends basically 0 vehicles to Japan, right? And as I mentioned before on the last slide, they send a considerable amount of vehicles here. There's really not a lot of upside. For example, if the U.S. and Japan reach an agreement where there's 0% on both sides, there's not a lot of upside. The types of vehicles that are produced in the U.S. and exported abroad aren't in very high demand in markets like Japan. Other products that, for example, the Japanese OEMs build here, particularly the smaller crossovers and passenger cars, are already produced in Japan. So there's really not a lot of upside on this. So the question is, and then obviously, so what do automakers do? What do suppliers do? What do logistics providers do? They say, understanding that this could go a couple different ways, right? Are these all negotiating tactics? Possibly, right? Or it seems unlikely that these are long-term sustainable tariffs, right? With the escalating numbers, you're talking 25% and up, it just doesn't seem sustainable in the long run. So from a strategy perspective, it's not advised that any company takes a long-term heavy investment based on what could be a very short-term event, right? So like I said, this could either be resolved in a matter of months through trade negotiations. This could potentially be resolved if there's a new presidential administration here in a couple years. In the meantime, so for example, countries that export vehicles to China, some have said, well, we're going to eat that cost for competitive reasons, right? Because if you all of a sudden have to pass a 40% import tariff along to customers in the largest automotive market in the world, which is highly competitive, your share is probably going to erode pretty quickly, all right? But if it's a long-term play, maybe you take your medicine for a few months or however long this lasts, and then there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Other companies have said they will pass that tariff on to customers, and we'll see how that shakes out. So again, right now I think a lot of companies are kind of sitting tight and figuring out what's going to happen over the long term before we make any significant decisions on this. So, developing situation. Okay, so I'm just going to close now with that in mind. Our sales and assembly outlook. So this is U.S. sales all the way back to 2002 out to 2024. So given what I've just talked about and sort of the potential uncertainty and rising tariff costs that could get passed along to consumers, we're starting to see a bit of a slowdown. And I think through July, actually, the industry is probably about flat from last year, but we do think there's going to be a continued slowdown for the rest of the year. So we're forecasting sales of 16.9 million units this year. And those concerns and those tariffs, and you've heard me talk before about increased interest rates, rising vehicle prices, will continue to slide down until around 2020, 2021, where we bottom out and then kind of tick back up. So we're looking at an industry stabilizing somewhere around 17 million units over the course of the forecast window. On the assembly side, now this is North America, so you've got U.S. and then Mexico and then Canada. The U.S., whether it was a combination of the tariff discussions or tax reform, you have seen significant amount of investment in capacity in the U.S. And so if you look at where we're at today, 11.1 million units, we're forecasting that to go up to almost 13 million units by the end of the forecast window. Again, combination of new facilities, expansion of existing facilities. And then Mexico, we're still pretty high on Mexico, but I think right now people are very much in a wait and see. So we haven't seen beyond what's already been announced over the last couple years in terms of new capacity. We haven't seen any new investments yet in Mexico until obviously the NAFTA situation is worked out, but then the broader tariff strategy as well. There's still some wild cards here. We don't have any Chinese OEMs. We might have one, a small facility in Mexico, but we don't have significant investment from Chinese OEMs in Mexico. That could certainly bump up the top line. And then Canada, I won't repeat that story again, but we're showing a market contraction in Canada as that assembly moves south, either in the US or to Mexico. All right, hopefully I stirred the pot enough. Look forward to your questions. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, Brandon. Thanks again to Kirk as well. So there you go. I mean, I think the job of an automotive analyst, it's never been easier, has it, Brandon? Given all the changes and potential directions things can go. Obviously, what you had there was two sets of quite different presentations, obviously, but obviously one set looking at what's happening on the government side to support the development of ports, and the other, of course, a more macro picture of what we see in the U.S. global economy on the regulatory and tariff side, and you kind of put the two together, I suppose, and we equal something about what direction this industry will be going. So really interesting there. I want to open it up. The floor is open for questions for our panelists. There's also some questions that you can put a question through on the app, or those who are watching live, as some already have. There's a place to ask questions just below the video screen as well, so do feel free to do that. We'll always give preference to someone who puts the hand up, honestly, in the room first, but everyone can get engaged here. So a question first from my side to kick us off, it's for Kirk, and it's, you showed a lot of the programs that are there from the federal side, including conversion of Tiger to build and other kind of things. What's the kind of trajectory of investment support from the government? Is it similar to what it's been, or is it growing? Is it decreasing? I know it's a lot of different things in there, so it's maybe not so easy to just answer it at one level. But obviously, this administration promised a lot of infrastructure investment in the campaign, and obviously has put some bills forward. But at the same time, some government departments clearly have a squeeze as well. So maybe you can just give us some perspective on that, and I'll join you guys over here now.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great question. I think I'd answer that question in two parts. One would be, the amount of government funding, obviously, in any given year, it ebbs and flows. Priorities change, and Congress determines priorities. So in that sense, for me or anyone to project, whatever the trajectory might be, it's very difficult, obviously. Certainly, the hope is that there is more investment in infrastructure going forward. It's a key ingredient to the economic success of our country. It supports, obviously, all businesses, certainly the automotive business. So yeah, very, very difficult to predict. The second part of my answer, I would say, is that these are all great government programs that are in place, and they change over time. One of the things that the government certainly would look favorably upon, and maybe obviously so, would be more private investment and shared investment in infrastructure. You've heard a lot the term P3 or PPP or public-private partnership, and ports are obviously, that's a natural breeding ground for those types of contracting schemes and relationships. The more private sector funding that can go into infrastructure, the better. It's obviously difficult for private enterprises to do that, unfortunately, in many cases. But there are instances where the economics make sense of doing that. So I would just say I would encourage any project sponsor, infrastructure project sponsor, to explore and entertain the realm of funding and financing possibilities. You can meld a government program with private financing, and not just at the federal level, at the state and local level as well. So those are just all things to keep in mind as this country, and quite frankly, the global economy thinks about how it needs the infrastructure, how it's going to support that to facilitate all the trade that's been talked about even just this morning.
Absolutely. Any comments or questions from the audience? Please put your hand up. We have mics going around, and sorry, we have a question right here in the corner. Yeah. So if we can just. Yes, you're very welcome. But hurry it up, please.
Good morning. Brandon, what's your forecast on the mix of trucks and cars? And also, what's the impact with your forecast on the price of fuel?
So the light truck versus passenger car mix for the U.S., that gap will continue to widen. If you look at the vehicles that have been introduced here over the last year or two, it's predominantly crossovers, mid-size pickups, mid-size SUVs, right? Things that are rounding out the lineups. You're seeing fewer and fewer passenger car nameplates. So from a share perspective in the U.S., by the end of our forecast window, if we're at 70% now, I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 75+% light truck versus passenger car. Fuel prices, that's one of those things. It's difficult to forecast. We usually follow the Energy Information Administration on where they've got fuel prices going. So we don't see any significant spikes here over the next few years, but we have seen a steady rise in that. But at least in the near term, we don't see that having a significant impact on those light truck sales. Even though fuel prices have continued to increase, people are still getting their hands on those light trucks as quickly as they can.
Brandon, your forecast that you showed, the U.S. sale and production outlook, did that assume a relative status quo in trade terms as we see them right now in terms of NAFTA, or did that assume any kind of change?
Yeah, I mean, from the sales top line perspective for the U.S., it certainly plays into it a little bit because this tension has been rising here over the last year or so. So yeah, it is played into it. Obviously, there are upside and downside scenarios depending on where that plays out. But from a baseline standpoint, we do have that playing into. And as I mentioned, the other impacts were increase in interest rates. We've already seen a couple this year. I think we've got one or two more scheduled. So as those auto loan interest rates continue to go up and vehicle prices continue to go up, that's putting more and more consumers out of the market for a new vehicle. So that's weighing down that. And then at some point, we got to have a recession at some point. Yeah. I don't know when that's going to be, but presumably that's in the next few years. But that does play into it to some degree, yes.
I think Dennis had another question. If you can say your name and company, by the way, so I know everyone knows you, Dennis.
Brandon, so obviously the tariff thing has changed some of this math dramatically at the moment. But going out to 2024, can we expect new players coming into the marketplace, primarily on the Chinese side, maybe?
Unlikely. Highly unlikely that you'll see a Chinese OEM setting up shop and selling vehicles with the distribution network, et cetera, in the U.S. in that time frame. I mean, it could happen. We've seen several announcements over the years that's been the plan, but this is a really tough and really expensive market to get into. So we don't have that built into our current forecast window. Beyond 2024, 2025, who knows? I think that becomes an increasingly likely, though, as we move out, just given the competitiveness of some of those manufacturers and their desire to expand. But I don't see it happening within our forecast window.
That could have been a kind of deja vu question from almost 10 years ago and a deja vu answer. As it sort of turns out, we've been waiting for this wave for some time. There was actually a question on, sorry, I'll pull it up here again. There was a question that came via the app that I wanted to give to Kirk. And the question was, and I think you'll like this one, are there any government plans about modifying the Jones Act, which has been in place since the 1920s, and according to the questioner, cannot answer the needs of the modern times and economy? So any perspective on the Jones Act? And for those of you not familiar with it, I'm sure most people in this are. That is rules around the U.S. Maritime trade needs to be U.S.-built vessels, I believe, or U.S.-registered vessels, and a number of other protections within that. So any views on that?
I think I'll have to punt on that one. My administration, or my agency, I should say, certainly supports the Jones Act. One of MARAD's missions is to support the merchant marine. So we advocate for training mariners, using U.S. flagships, and so I guess I would just state that's our general policy, and thank you for the question.
Fair enough.
Smart call.
And by that it means I'll never return here again. No, I'm joking. No, thank you. Obviously, I think we're not too surprised by the answer there. Jones Act always a controversial topic here, and probably amongst this sort of trade, where we see different sort of dynamics in other parts of the world as well. Brandon, do you think the divergence or expected divergence in U.S. fuel economy standards, and notably even with the simple forecast you laid out, in which the U.S. share of, let's say, alternative powertrain production is 11% versus 30% for China and higher for the EU and China, is that an economic risk? Is that a risk in the kind of sense of where the U.S. industry is globally competitive and playing in that market, or is the kind of size and dynamic here kind of insulate the U.S. from that global size?
Well, for the global automakers that are out there, I mean, their goal is to meet the needs and the demand of the consumers in the respective markets around the world. What we've seen so far in the U.S. is that there's just not a significant demand for those types of products. Now, you could make the argument that that's similar in other parts of the world, but they have a regulatory environment that's mandating those. And so in that case, those automakers have to follow the mandates of the regulatory environment and those markets. So in the U.S., absent significant demand on the consumer side for those alternative propulsion vehicles and a regulatory environment that's not strictly enforcing them, there's really not a lot of incentive to do so. But I mean, if you're a global automaker, you're going to have those technologies available to you. You just might not disperse them as much in the U.S. From an economic impact, we talk about the value that light trucks and pickups and that bring. Companies that are selling those products are making money hand over fist right now. If you think longer term about mobility solutions and the development of those technologies, certainly there's a huge economic impact. Who is going to be the leader to develop those technologies, and not just who, but where are those technologies developed and what's the economic impact there. But how they're spread out and the adoption rate is going to vary considerably. So is there an economic impact? Potentially, but I just think because of the global environment, you're not siloed in there and saying because there's not high demand or there's not a mandate for those alternative propulsion vehicles in the U.S., that's going to have a negative economic impact on the company globally.
Right. That sort of leads to one of the questions on our app from Bobby Harra from Nissan is actually more for the audience, and so we can actually use our red and green cards here, and I think they're the right colors for this question actually. So how many in the audience currently own an electric, hybrid, or alternative fuel vehicle? So let's do green if you own a green vehicle, if you accept that definition. So it's either electric, hybrid, or alternative. So who has green? And if anyone's drinking a gas guzzler and a petrol diesel car, let it be red. So
it doesn't mean that it's a gas guzzler just because it's...
I think in the U.S. your figures show that it probably is, but I'm sorry, I withdraw that comment. That showed some unnecessary bias there. I'm looking at a sea of red either way. I think I spotted there's perhaps two green in this audience.
Thank you for proving my point, audience.
It's probably not. I don't think that surprises us, but it does reflect. Not necessarily and it reflects the general public, right? We said 1%, certainly 1% was the electric vehicle or even below, right? Okay, hybrids would bring that up a bit. So yeah, makes the point. We have some dynamic here in the U.S. which isn't necessarily the same elsewhere. Although, having said that, it wouldn't be a sea of green in Europe necessarily either, but there would be more. We have a question right in the middle. We have the mic coming to you. Yep, there you go.
Hi, Matthew Martin from NORAD up in Davisville. Craig, this question for you. Seeing this to the room, do you see any plans coming across your desk to move anything other than containers on the Marine Highway, or is it all pretty much container traffic?
That's a great question. Certainly one of the pushes in recent years has been container on barge, for instance, unitization of movement of freight. Is the focus solely on containers? Certainly not. If you recall in some of the slides I put up, for example, there's all sorts of different freight, as we all know. There's all sorts of different ports that are needed, different sizes of ports, different locations and regions for this country, and certainly that's similar in other parts of the world. There's bulk freight. A lot of energy moves in barges in this country on the inland waterway system, Ohio River, Mississippi River, so on and so forth. I guess that's kind of a simple answer to say that while certainly we do look for efficiencies and use in using unitized freight movements, boxes, for example, certainly we all know that this country, there's movements of all sorts of different freight, energy, agriculture, and those different types of freight require different facilities. Agriculture might, require conveyor belts, silos at the port, for example. It's not just the deep blue water ports on the coast, right? There's ports all across the country on the inland waterways. There's different sizes of ports, and the facilities that are designed and constructed to help facilitate commerce at different points in our nation certainly are all unique. Hopefully it answers your question at least a little bit, that we'd certainly try to diversify and have a resilient system in this country.
Very good, thank you. Any other comments, questions from the audience in that? Actually, yeah, there was another question or comment on the app, and I think it's something that probably we'll be discussing throughout the day, particularly with some of our other panelists who work in the ports or vehicle makers who interact with the ports. Because the comment in question was actually around the port definitions in some way, and the question was, how is the role of ports likely to evolve in automotive production and distribution processes, such as new activities that might be trusted to ports, that present activities led elsewhere? So I think to do with the services and kind of operations that actually happen in a port, I guess in automotive industry, we might think about accessorization as one example, some value-added services that we see and how that may or may not develop. So Kirk, if you have any comments you want to make in terms of what you see or where some of the funding may be, potentially going, I mean, that may also be a question to some extent better suited to some of the private operators as well. But if you have any comments on that.
No, that's a great point. I would say for sure there are probably folks in this audience have better answers than I do, quite frankly. At the federal level, we do see projects that come across our agency that are certainly roll-on, roll-off related, certainly automotive related. We've seen different designs of facilities come through our agency. So yes, it is on our radar screen. And again, if there are programs, for example, at the federal level that make sense to meld with your private operations and your private funding sources, then yeah, I would say let's start a conversation about that. And but yeah, I agree with your point. There's certainly going to be other speakers here throughout the day that will have varying perspectives and hopefully give a broader sense of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, as we talked about, the theme Gateways to the Future is partly what we want to hear more about, your ideas as well, about what might happen in the port as technology changes, as vehicles change, and as trade changes. There was another question on the app, perhaps more of a comment. It is directed to Brandon, but the comment was it fair for the EU to have had, during the Obama administration, a 10% tariff against US vehicles entering, and the US to have a 2.5% tariff? To be fair, I think that's not an Obama-era policy as such. This is WTO standards as I understand them, so that's pretty historic. But I mean, there's the point made. There is a difference between the tariff levels, and is this should we be having those change? Is this a measure to go about that? Well, eventually, do you see those changing, as I suppose what I would sort of add to that?
Well, that's the hope, right? I mean, to answer the question, I mean, just by the numbers, yeah, it is unfair, right? If one person's charging 10% import tax, there's 2.5. I think it's difficult then, but to look at trade imbalance based on the size of the economies, right? So the U.S. as the largest economy in the world, well, typically you're going to have a trade imbalance with different countries. The question is, based on the products that you're talking about, is there parity? Is it fair? And so I think the European Union negotiators have said we're open to reducing that 10% import tariff. I mean, I think everybody's come out and said, at the end of the day, we live in a global economy. Do significant import tariffs really make sense anymore? And we could argue about that all day, what that is. But I think a lot of people agree that the answer is not increasing those tariffs. It's probably doing the other way. The question is, will cooler heads prevail?
Yeah.
We'll see.
And I mean, the thing, as you alluded to in your presentation, I mean, the 2.5% is unfair, but we have to also remember that there's a 25% tax on the most profitable segment
That's right.
of this, in terms of the chicken tax and the production of trucks and things like that. So it adds complication into the mix. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the Juncker announcement sort of put automotive tariffs to the side as they look to negotiate in the first instance. So it's a tricky subject. Any other? We have another question right there. Right. Yep.
I'm Charles Franklin from American Honda, and so with these tariffs, it seems like they're very self-centered. And what I mean by that is most of the OEMs now produce globally, and so when you make it restrictive to produce in one country, we have the ability to produce in another country that may have better trade agreements with the country that we want to sell to. So a lot of times we put those tariffs, what you're doing, you're really negatively impacting American jobs because, I mean, we produce in 33 countries. So we can say, okay, it costs too much for me to build it in America and ship it to X, so I'll build it in Thailand and ship it to X because they have a better tariff rate. So with all of these tariffs, are those considerations happening because everybody builds everywhere?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great point. We live in a different world today than we did, 30 years ago, where, people were primarily regionally based and then you exported to where the demand was. Again, it's a global industry. We've got, large footprints across the world. I think where you get into that is not so much the global products, but more the specialty products or smaller volume products. So, I mean, for example, you look at the 270,000 vehicles or so that we shipped to China last year. Some of those you started to get to a point where you've got critical mass and say, okay, we could localize production. Others are, specialty products where the value case still isn't there. The question on products like that is, could those products absorb a significant import tariff if they're already a premium type of product? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I do agree with your comment that, I mean, at the end of the day, you're just hurting consumers, right? I mean, these are protectionist policies that don't really have a long-term gain for the economy of those local markets, and very much so for the consumers.
Yeah, but it's not just the consumers, it's the American worker. Because if it's cheaper for me to build a car for another destination somewhere else, then those cars, instead of being built in Ohio and Alabama and Indiana, will be built in that more competitive place. And so, a lot of, like I said before, Mexico's popularity with the OEMs is not primarily the cheap labor, it's that they have FTA agreements with over 60% of the global economy. And so if you build there, it's easy to ship it to these economies because the tariffs are better.
Yep. Well, so now you get into a point where, you talk about the 4 million vehicles or so that the U.S. exported last year. To your point, then what percentage of those vehicles get produced abroad so they don't have to deal with all the tariffs being produced in the U.S.? And that's a good question. I mean, you'd have to look at program by program and say, what is what? I mean, if we keep escalating tariffs, then really the end result is the vehicles that you produce within that market are strictly for the consumption in that market. And then what are the subsequent economic impacts of that? So if we're exporting 4 million vehicles abroad now, let's just say we get rid of that 4 million units of exports because nobody wants to deal with us, or it becomes more costly to produce vehicles in the U.S. and then be imposed that tariff, yeah, that's a lot of jobs, that's a lot of assembly plants that potentially could be at risk. That's a valid point.
We obviously were talking about green in the sense of electric powertrain or alternative powertrain, but the other side, of course, would be around regulations. And I wanted to ask you, Kirk, if the regulatory framework for ports in terms of environmental protection, in terms of whether that's land use, whether that's emissions, do you see the current structure fit for purpose? Is it set to change or evolve? Not least based on perhaps what some of this administration wants to do in terms of the deregulatory side, but what's your kind of view on that?
Sure. I won't pretend to be an environmental expert, so there are a lot of different facets that go into that. It's a definite specialty. Maybe I'll speak to it from the angle I deal with. As we look at infrastructure projects for ports, there are certainly federal regulations that go around any sort of federal action and federal funding mechanism. So for example, NEPA, if you all are familiar with that acronym, National Environmental Policy Act, is certainly something that needs to be adhered to as you assess the environmental impact of any project across any federal action. And when we talk about ports for sure, what you find is a lot of port rehabilitation projects are occurring on industrial sites, brownfield sites that already are, where the impacts, any sort of new development on that site is going to be minimal from an environmental perspective, but certainly we go through our processes to gauge what that might be. And in that way, you run through your scenarios, you make sure you're not doing anything that's detrimental or really detrimental to the environment. And those decisions are all feed into the process of whether you decide to move forward with it for sure. So it's not just about the funding and financing, it is about the environmental impacts and regulations and other things that go around that.
Absolutely. Do we have any last questions perhaps from the audience at this time? I do see another question on the app, which I can make the last one, but otherwise, if the room has a question, we'll take that as the last question. Okay, in that case, the question on the app, which comes from Ports America, for Brandon, what is his view, initially you're not going to like it, but it's not as bad as you think, of Tesla and Volvo going all electric? Will this be an impact at all? Will Tesla go, the second part, you may or may not want to answer, will Tesla go private in your opinion? And what about your views on whether they'll be profitable in about a year? So that's actually about 3 or 4 questions packed into one, but I might just let you answer the ones where you feel you can answer on that.
Cool. I think one of the questions there was around like an all-electric...
So the view of the car makers like Tesla or Volvo going all electric within a defined period, and what the impact will be of that.
Sure. I mean, there's a progression there, right? I mean, eventually, if you believe what's been laid out, at some point in the future, theoretically, everybody will be electric or hydrogen fuel cell or whatever it might be. So it's really about what path are you going to go on and what's the pace of change there. If there's demand for it, I think in the case of Volvo, for example, I think they have stated they've got a progression, right? So they're going to have a completely hybrid lineup here over the next several years. That doesn't mean electric. That means a hybrid, gas engine, and I think perhaps longer term than you transition to electrification. So, yeah, I mean, I don't see, again, depends on the demand for your customers. If your customers are telling you that we're okay with a hybrid, which nobody should have a problem with a hybrid powertrain today, it shouldn't matter, or fully electric, yeah, down the road, sure. I mean, obviously plans can change based on the demand, so that plan could get pushed back out. The other one I'm just not going to comment on. So.
Watch Twitter for the other bit, I think, about what may or may not happen with Tesla and going private. Okay, great. Well, we've used a little bit more than the time that we set out and we kind of expected that with such interesting speakers and topics here and the questions that would come. Before we break, though, I wanted to give you a last chance to vote on the poll which we had, and we'll reveal your answers. So again, this is via our app, which hopefully most of you by now have downloaded and are using either to see the schedule, ask questions, connect with delegates, etc. Go to the polling section and let us know what you think is currently the biggest challenge for North American vehicle imports and exports. Again, international trade uncertainty, lack of space or investment, inland transport capacity, ocean capacity, or poor visibility and planning of flows in and out of the ports. So if you haven't voted, vote in the next couple of seconds now, and then we'll show you the answer. So, wow, pretty overwhelming there. That's pretty overwhelming. That's actually bigger than I almost thought, considering currently the biggest challenge. Obviously, that uncertainty raises, it may or may not be the tariffs that are hitting you now, but obviously you're worried about that uncertainty and what it might mean for investment, what it might mean for your plans in future. So 45%, actually look at that as the biggest challenge of what we have right now. And second place, inland transport capacity, servers in and out of the ports. So that's all the topics we'll talk more about in particular over the next couple of sessions. We have more polling questions to get your answer, but we're going to save those in the interest of time. So let you have some coffee. We're going to also rejig the room a little bit just to make a bit more space for some of you here. And, but I want to thank both of our panelists for their great presentations, for the Q&A and discussion. Thank you all as well for your participation and questions. And we'll see you back here in 11. So thank you.